If you watch only one of my videos this year, let it be this one. I know that's a huge claim, but really, friends, I want you to forget rules. I want you to forget right, and I want you to remember joy. And you're going to remember this moment because it's where it all started. My name's Kristy Rice, and I am obsessed with watercolor, but I do things a little differently, a lot differently, actually. The question of how to get started with watercolor is often laden with heaviness and doubt and fear and anxiety and all the things, but it shouldn't be. It doesn't have to be. And let me tell you why. This watercolor mastermind takes my 3 most popular videos ever on this channel and brings them together, but with a twist. First, we'll be creating technique charts, but not the boring kind, I promise. I'll be showing you right away how to apply these techniques to real art and also how to think about starting to break the rules. Next, we'll talk about water control and how important it is in banishing watercolor frustration. And finally, we'll look at how all of these techniques work together and build upon one another to really skyrocket your comfort level with watercolor. But here's the twist. In between each section of the mastermind, I'm going to be answering questions that came from the community who first watched these videos. So I'll be expanding on the most asked questions, and I'll be painting out the answers for you. So even if you've watched all of these videos before I brought them together in this mastermind, there is a ton of new content here for you too.
So you want to know the basics of watercolor, like where to start. But then what do you do with all that? How do all these basic techniques work together in real life? That is the question. I've taught thousands of people over the years, and the biggest roadblock I see folks running into again and again is, I don't know what to use. I don't have a ton of money to spend on this. Even if I did learn the, quote, right techniques, what do I do with them? And there's 50 million different types of watercolor palettes and even more brushes, and oh my gosh. And then you know what happens? They don't do any of it. They just walk away. Well, friends, I'm here today because I don't want you to walk away from watercolor. I want you to walk towards it. Maybe even run a little bit. I mean, I don't run, but you know what I mean. I want you to run towards the joy of watercolor and all that it's holding for you. Listen, I have my favorite brushes. I have my favorite palettes. But the number one thing that you need to know to get started is to meet yourself where you're at. Use what you have, or use what is the easiest and most affordable to get your hands on. For the first part of today's lesson, I'm going to be using Crayola watercolors. That's right, because I want to prove to you that you don't need to be super precious about your supplies. Now, it's a different thing once you get into this and you know you're loving it and you want to level up. That's a whole different ballgame. But don't let the pursuit of the, quote, perfect materials slow you down and stop you from chasing the joy that is watercolor. Gosh, I hope my passion doesn't come off as like bossiness, because I don't mean to be bossy. I just feel so passionate, and I know how watercolor has changed my life, and I want it to change yours too. I'm going to teach you the basics. But then I'm going to follow up with a step-by-step painting that clearly shows you all of these techniques, how they work in a real-life painting. So you're left feeling empowered to move on and create your own artwork. Okay, let's talk about supplies. Now, I mentioned I'm going to be using Crayolas for this section. Trust me, if that's what you have, please use it. Don't delay. Just dive right in. I'm also going to be using my brush collection, the Art for Joy's Sake brush collection. If you want to know more about it, check in the information section below. And then Academy watercolor paper. Friends, I love this paper. It's affordable, and it lets me not feel guilty about the fact that I use watercolor paper a little bit like I use water. Okay, so pause the video after I finish this sentence because I want you to recreate this chart. My paper's square. I don't care. Whatever size your paper is, just make it work. Create this chart. You've got the word wowed at the top and then a column on the left, wet on wet, wet on dry, wet on damp. And while you're creating this chart, I want you to spray down your watercolors. Get them all nice and juicy. All right, go ahead, give this a pause and come back when you've got your chart ready. I know what you're thinking. This feels like a little bit like elementary art class, but trust me, these charts, we're going to make 2 of them that you create today. They're going to be yours and you're going to get to refer to them again and again. Remember, friends, this is a course that I have taught to folks nationwide and globally over the years. Thousands of folks that have paid money for this particular content. And the thing they tell me year after year again and again is they love their charts and they do use them often. All right, let's talk a little bit about WOW'd. WOW'd in my world is the trifecta of watercolor. Once you master WOW'd, you are going to soar. So WOW'd, wet on wet, wet on dry, wet on damp. WOW'd. So watercolor is all about pigment and water and how they interact at different quantities. That's basically it. So for today, I'm going to be using this 1/2-inch dagger from my brush collection. The first thing I want you to do is take some clean water and make a real lazy square in that first section. Pick up your favorite color and paint over that clean water. You're already going to notice how the pigment is moving in the clean water very easily. Grab a second color and add to it. Watch how those 2 colors mingle. And then if you're feeling adventurous, add a third. That, my friends, is wet on wet. You can start with clean water and drop in color to see the explosions. You could start directly on the page with the color, drop in more color to see the explosions. That is your classic wet on wet. Take a moment to watch what's happening. Now, if you forgot to spray your palette, especially if you're using Crayolas or any other student grade watercolor, you're probably not going to be seeing the intensity of color and the explosiveness that you're seeing on my screen. So I just want to remind you that spraying your palette is gold. It loosens up the pigments. It creates like a syrupy consistency that really, really gets onto the wet paper and does its thing. If you need to pause, spray the palette and try this again, go right ahead. Now I'm grabbing my flat wash brush. It's a 3/4 inch. Friends, a note about brushes, use what you have. Don't worry if you don't have mine. And I'm going right in and laying down some color like I mentioned earlier, just making a lazy little square, getting some color on there, rinsing my brush. And now I'm grabbing another color and dabbing it in to just see what happens. See what happens. Lovely. So good. Now, this is a Crayola palette. The colors are limited. Things are going to be kind of muddy a little bit, but I wanted to use this palette to prove a point, and that you shouldn't let whatever simple or meager materials that you have stop you from getting yourself going with watercolor. Now, let's look at it in real life example. I am painting in some very simple teardrop flower petals in clean water. And I'm adding in some color on top of them and letting that color just conform and shape to the brushstroke of water that I just laid down. See that? That is your classic wet on wet. Beautiful. This is an in real life example of how this fundamental technique actually functions. So good. And I'm changing up my colors as I go. Started with red and a little bit of orange, a little bit of yellow. And there we have it. That is your classic wet on wet. You want to get even more adventurous? Grab a little bit of that brown or the black in your Crayola set and dab it around the center of the flower. And boom, watch it start to explode. That's fun. And friends, it's going to explode. It's going to get out of control. It's going to be weird looking when it dries. I'm telling you this just from experience, but we don't learn anything when we don't push the limits of the materials. So it's good for you to experience this. All right, next up is wet on dry. Grab a color and apply it right to the dry page. Right on there, that's wet on dry. Experiment with another lazy square, but with less water on your brush and see how that feels. Now go in and make some simple strokes, curving to meet each other underneath. Let's call it a flower. I don't know, maybe what are they called? A water lily? Or it doesn't have to be anything. I just want you to see how the wet on dry produces a much more intense color quickly because you don't have as much water on your brush to dilute the pigment. See that? Now I told you things were going to get muddy because it's a very limited palette, but stick with me. Now we're quickly getting into a wet on wet situation. And that's why these techniques, these 3 techniques, they're so integral to one another because they play into each other so easily and so quickly. Grabbing that 3/4 inch flat wash brush again. And we are going to, now my water isn't terribly clean, but that's okay. I got a little bit of a blue haze, but I'm going to wet down this entire long skinny rectangle on the wet on damp section. Just wet it down. You don't want a puddle. You just want a nice, even, damp surface. We're going to experiment now with the 1/2 inch dagger, and we're going to just make a simple stroke. Right away, I want you to see what the stroke looks like right away before that wash of water underneath starts to dry. And then I am going to allow about a minute in between each stroke. Now we're going to kind of fast forward through this, and I'm going to make another stroke. And I want you to see how it changes. The beauty of wet on damp is that you get the explosion, but it's more subtle and it's slower. So when you add wet color to a damp page, you can get these glorious, diffused, soft effects. And you can see how that's changing as that underlayer of water dries. Friends, your chart does not have to be perfect. Let that be another lesson for today. If you've got some paint that's kind of leaked into other sections, maybe the green of your wet on damp has leaked into the purple of your wet on dry, it is okay. I want you to get through this chart. You can always do this chart again at another time if you want to be extra or if you felt like your first was too sloppy, but just do me a favor and get through this one. No tearing up pages, no getting frustrated with yourself if your chart isn't perfect. Because I guarantee you, I don't care what kind of color is going wherever it's going, you are learning something right now. You really are. It's good stuff. Moving on now and watching how these green strokes subtly get more crisp, more defined as the paper underneath dries. And just think about how that can be used later on for adding shadows, for adding depth. It's a wonderful realization that watercolor isn't just lots of water, messy pigment, splashing everywhere. It also has the most glorious subtleties imaginable. Friends, I gotta say, I am having a blast revisiting these techniques. It's such a joy to bring them to you. And if you're having fun, I would love if you'd give this video a boop. And a boop is just a like, and it lets I almost said Instagram algorithm, the YouTube algorithm know that we're all having a good time and that more of you should join in. I'd appreciate it. But let's keep moving. Yes, we're about to make another chart. It's gotta happen. This time our chart has 5 sections. We're going to be talking about 5 different techniques: flooding, ombre, lifting, scrubbing, and my favorite, line work. Now, flooding, some people will call a dragging effect. Ombre also. I think these have kind of differences, nuances, so I've given them separate names. I guess what I'm saying here, friends, is there's a lot of incredible content here on YouTube about watercolor, and everybody approaches things a little differently, myself included. So I'm not sitting here trying to make you believe I'm reinventing the wheel, but I am building the wheel a little bit differently. That's all. So if you're sitting there wondering, like, wait a minute, what's flooding? Well, it's another word, another term for dragging. And that's just one example. But if you have questions about how I've named things, definitely hit me up in the comments and I will explain it for you. No worries. So the thing about flooding is about control, because watercolor, as we know, friends, it has a mind of its own. So let me show you what flooding is all about. I am going to use my hero brush, the 1/4" dagger. Now, before we get any further, I have changed palettes. I am using my Holbein palette. This is a much better quality palette, but again, you can keep using your Crayolas or whatever it is that you have. The key to getting strong pigment, even out of an affordable student grade palette, is just spraying that palette down. I want you to add some intense color to the far left side. I don't care what it looks like, just a couple strokes. And then I want you to rinse your brush, fill it up with tons of water, and just start pushing some of that clean water towards, in my case, the red, and just push it around. Keep adding clean water and push and flood. You're flooding that color. You're flooding that brightness. You're pushing it around. You're bullying that color. Just imagine how this technique can come in handy when you're creating shading, when you're creating highlights, because you can also flood with a color. There you go. This is essentially wet on wet, but we're building on wet, because we are not just laying the color on top of a wet surface. We are pushing the color around. We're flooding. We're using a lot of pigment and a lot of water to push and move the pigment around the page. It's incredible. Once you know how to work the water and the pigment in this way, you won't be able to remember a time when you didn't have it at your fingertips. It's incredible. Did I already say that? I feel like I say that all the time. So in real life, mountains. I'm going to create a very simple mountain scene here. Very, very impressionistic. Couple of colors, and then boom, I'm flooding in from underneath some of that just clean water, flooding it up, pushing it up towards the edge of that mountain scene I created, and I'm getting instant dimension, instant shadow and highlight. And now I'm flooding with yellow to create a little bit of foreground. Look at that. So that is flooding used in real life, friends. You could use flooding in a sky, add a little bit of blue, a little bit of a bouncy, swirly blue effect in the sky, and then quickly flood underneath or to the side of those blue brush strokes with clean water. And you'll start to see the beginnings of a cloud appear. Really cool. I love it. Now, whether you are a more realistic painter or you're more impressionistic like me, these techniques work. They flow. Because friends, I got to tell you, sometimes I get super hyper realistic. Oh yeah, I do. And these techniques work, whether I'm being loosey-goosey, free, spirit, Kristy, or I'm being super tight, conscientious, and in the zone. Next up, we have what I call ombre. And I love ombre for creating a very smooth, evenly transitioned, dark to light effect. This is great if you're working on galaxies, aurora borealis. It's when you don't want that cauliflower effect going on where things burst and dry with weird edges. So you lay down a little bit of color. I'm using the 3/4" flat wash brush so I can get coverage a little easier. And then I go right next door with some clean water. And I basically start dragging out that color and keep adding clean water right next to my last brush stroke. Don't panic if you get a little bit of an explosion, a little intrusion from a previous section. It's okay. And just keep dragging that out, clean water. This is also a form of pulling. Dragging it out, dragging it out. And this is how you get a smooth transition from bright to light, dark to light, opaque to sheer. And you can use this in countless ways. It doesn't have to just be for skies or galaxies or the sort. This can be used to create the most gorgeous flower petals with highlights and shadows made effortlessly. So a key to this is not using too much water or things will get out of control quickly. Now I laid down one stroke of that pink using my cat's tongue brush, and right next to it, I laid down a stroke of just water and let them bleed together. And look at that. One stroke of color, rinse my brush, have a nice amount of water on the cat's tongue, put it right next door, and boom. Instant, beautiful, shaped petal. Just going to keep going with that. You could change your colors up a little bit. Done. That is ombre used in real life. Love it. Let's use the ombre effect to create a leaf because why not? One stroke, kind of a nice slow curve, and some water right next door. Look at that. Some more right next door, repeating that shape, that curve, that initial brush stroke. And you, friends, have a leaf instantly. Gorgeous. I'm a big believer in KISS. Keep it simple, stupid. Now, my dad was in the military, and that was, a very non-PC kind of colloquialism. But it's something I think about a lot. KISS, Kristy, KISS. Keep it simple. The things that can be simple and beautiful and effortless, why not let them be? All right, now quickly for lifting, I'm putting down a little bit of color, a couple of blues right next to each other, but we're not going to do anything with them quite yet because I need them to dry a little bit. So work with me. Friends, if you need to pause, take a break, take a breath, get a drink, do it. But I've got a couple of greens right next to each other. I'm letting them run into each other on purpose, but just know we're going to come back to that section. Next, we have scrub. I'm still using the cat's tongue brush. Friends, let me tell you a little bit about the cat's tongue brush. It is a lovely stiff brush. It doesn't have as much bounce as many of your daggers or your round brushes because it's shorter, comes to a point, and it's fantastic for control, fantastic for texture, and it's also amazing for getting a really good amount of color on the page quickly and intensely. So for scrubbing here, I'm doing just that. I'm just stroking some red onto the page, not really worrying about exactly how. And I am also going to come back to that section later. So take a moment, get your lifting section and your scrub section juiced up with some paint and get them drying. And now we're going to move on to line work and come back. Line work, I am using a liner brush. Let's talk a little bit about the liner brush. A traditional liner brush has a longer bristle. My liner brush is it's just a little bit over a 1/2 inch long. And you might think, oh my gosh, that sounds like it would be so out of control. But it's not. It's lovely. It takes a little bit of practice. And that's what we're doing here today. But oh, friends, it creates the most graceful, undulating, effortless lines that you could imagine. Now, the key to your line work and using the liner brush is making sure you have a good amount of water and pigment on the brush. When you don't have quite enough water, you'll start to see texture in your line. Your line will look a little raggedy. If you like that look, great. I sometimes love that look. But if you're not feeling it, just dip the tip of your liner brush in a little bit of water and move on. And you're going to see that line become so smooth and lovely. And chef's kiss. It just deserves a chef's kiss. A little bit of practice with this line quality technique will go a long way. Try to place lines super, super close together, barely touching or not touching at all. Try to create kind of a wave-like appearance with a collection of lines. Another favorite exercise of mine is creating lines, vertical lines, up and down, different widths, and notice the pressure difference. If you press just a little bit on this brush, it will make a thicker line just like that. Thinner, thicker, thinner, thicker. You can go back and forth so easily. And I love that. It creates gorgeous branches. It's just such a wonderful brush. And you can make small, short, curved lines. Imagine what you could use those for, adding shape to a tree trunk and dimension to a tree trunk. You can literally bounce the brush up and down until the paint runs out to create incredible textures. You can use that technique radiating around the center of a flower or in a landscape in the distance to create a sense of some shrubbery on a horizon line or trees on a horizon line. I guess you really wouldn't have shrubbery on a horizon line, but you know what I mean. Now that our lifting section has dried a bit, we're going to go back and work in that area. You're going to get a clean brush. I'm using the cat's tongue brush, and I am adding some clean water and a little upward motion. And this has been dry for about 10 minutes or so. And I'm lifting up, scooping up the moisture and blotting it on my paper towel. This, friends, is lifting. Scoop it up, blot. Now, depending on the brand of paints, you're going to be able to lift a lot easier or not so easy. Just depends on the type of paints. Again, I'm using Holbein and they lift beautifully. Imagine what you can do with lifting. It's a wonderful way to create instant highlights. It's a wonderful way you can lift away paint you put down previous, and then you can add in a different color over top while that surface is still a little bit damp. So you'd be back to a wet on damp. Lifting is something I use all the time. It's become almost self-conscious. It's just a way to continue to control the pigment on the page and the amount of water on the page. And how does lifting work in real life? Let's see. I'm going to create a leaf here, just a simple shape, press, drag, and lift, and then fill in the middle because I am using a smaller brush. And we'll come back to that later once it's had a little time to dry. Going back to scrubbing. Now, scrubbing is basically a little bit more of an aggressive version of lifting and more haphazard. So you can add the clean water on top of that dried pigment and you can scrub it around and lift, or you can just scrub out and let the pigment, the softer tone of the pigment, just scrub out into other areas of the painting. Scrubbing also works just as a way to lay down paint. Imagine creating gorgeous flowers with this technique. It's bouncy, scrubby, swirly. It's just a little bit more of an active way to get paint on the page. It's definitely not a graceful way to get paint on the page. Your hand is moving constantly. The motion is kind of limited to your fingers, so you're not getting a lot of sweeping motion. I love scrubbing for certain types of flowers. And remember, you can scrub a little bit and blot on your paper towel a little bit to remove paint. It's a great way to soften edges between two colors. The one note I will say is don't over scrub. Don't use too much pressure. Don't stay in one spot. With this motion for too long, you could start to break down your paper. All right, while that dries a little bit too, let's go back to line work. Line work isn't just limited to a liner brush. I'm using the cat's tongue here. It has a dimensional point, which means it comes to a point, but it doesn't come to a fine hair-like point. It's a dimensional point. So you can make gorgeous lines with it, but they're a little bit thicker, a little bit more robust. Same with the 1/2-inch dagger. Light touch and just whisper above the page and look at those gorgeous, soft, graceful lines you can get. I love it. Try it. Try this with whatever brushes you have. I'm going to try it with the 3/4-inch flat wash brush. Wait till you see. This brush is magic. It can do so much. Pick up a little paint, dab, and then let's see what we can do to create some line work. You'll be surprised. Look at that. Look at that. I'm using just the corner of the brush on an angle. Again, thicker lines for sure, but imagine branches, stems, the beginnings of trees. You can use this in so many different ways. You can literally bounce this brush up and down perpendicular to the page. My hand will move in a moment. You can see what I've created. Look at that. That's a tree line in the making. So now we're going to go back up to the ombre section where I created this sweet little flower. And I want to show you in real life how line work can literally bring to life a flower. All right, so we're going to just grab a little bit of pigment. You can choose to be soft. You could go with a soft pink. I'm going to go a little bit more bold because I really want this line work to show up. And I'm radiating out these thin lines, as thin as I can get them from the center of the flower. And just don't mind my hand. It's the way I hold my brush. I am having this brush almost perpendicular to the page. very light touch, and I'm following the contour of the petal. And guess what? I love going outside the lines of those petals, because when this flower started, it was very bubbly, very sweet, almost childlike in appearance because of the shape of the painted petals. But when I'm adding this line work, I'm making each petal a little bit wider in areas, come to a point in areas with the line work, and it becomes a much more elegant and graceful flower. Gorgeous. Look at that. Look at that. I'm going around the center, which is the tip of my liner now, and doing a little scrubbing action, scrubbing with a liner brush. See, what I love about these techniques, once you learn the basics, then you start to figure out how the basic techniques mingle with one another. And that's when the magic starts happening. Now, friends, I want you to stick around because we're going to do just that really soon here. We're going to paint together. We're going to paint an actual composition. And I'm going to show you how all these techniques play, how they mingle, and how they love to work with one another. Now, I'm using the 1/4-inch dagger to show you some line work on this leaf. I love this 1/4-inch dagger, and if for a lot of people it's very much like the number 6 or 8 round brush that comes to a nice point. You might have one of those. It's just incredibly versatile. You can make such thin lines with it. I love it. Another thing you can do with the liner brush is you can sketch with it like I am now. Look at that. Create a thin line, little stems coming out from your flower, and then turn the ends of them into sweet little teardrop leaves. I love that so much. Oh, you have to try this little flower. You have to. It's so fun. Friends, if you're having a good time, just a quick reminder, if you'd like to give this video a boop, I'd be all for it. Thank you so much. Now we're going back to the lifting section. We're going to see what we're going to do with this leaf. I'm using my number 2 round brush, clean water on that brush. I'm going along the top edge and I added some clean water initially, and now I'm stroking it away. I'm lifting it away just along that top edge to give a little bit of a highlight, like the sun is shining right down on the top edge of that leaf. Look at that. So simple, so effortless to create some amazing dimension. Now, don't forget, your leaf is wet in areas now. It's definitely still damp in areas. You can go on in there and do a little wet on wet action with some darker pigment, which I'm about to do. Look at that, gorgeous. Now you have some really high highs, meaning super light, and some really low lows, meaning dark. And talk about dimension. It's gorgeous. Now add a little water back in, flood in a little water. Remember flooding, adding water or pigment and pushing that paint around that's already on the page, and things will start to blend and mingle. And there you have it. Gorgeous, gorgeous. Let's see some scrubbing in real life. Going back to that cat's tongue, got the point facing out. I'm radiating around an imaginary center, letting the paint run out, and I'm just scrubbing around and around and around until I have this kind of blobby looking flower. I'm immediately adding a little yellow around the center. This is fast and loose, friends. So we went from scrubbing right into wet on wet. It's good. Wait till you see this. Going around the edge now with a little scrubbing, bouncing action with a bright pink. Think about this. This could be a mum. This could be a carnation from a top-down view. So many things. This could be a pom-pom flower, just a basic. Imagine a bunch of these little flowers clustered together with some stems connecting them. Great for filler. And then I'm doing a little scrubbing action to create some leaves. So your watercolor brushstrokes don't always have to be graceful and fluid. They can be bouncy, they can be scratchy, they can be a little messy to really mix it up on the page. Adding a little extra green on top of that yellow for some instant dimension. And there you have the beginnings of a sweet little flower that you can use in so many ways. All right, friends, in this next section, we are going to paint together. We're going to do a leafy composition, and I want to just explain a little bit how this is going to work. And because I don't want you to be overwhelmed, but this section, I believe, is really important. This is where we're going to bring it all together. And in my classes, this is how I teach. I teach the basics. I have you make your own charts of the techniques. And then we get down to the fun of actually painting a composition that brings together all of the techniques. So I would recommend keeping your charts nearby. If you need to rewind and watch another section again, don't feel bad. Don't feel like you have to get through this all in one sitting. Come back to it if you feel like you need a breather. But friends, we're about to have fun, and I think you're about to have your watercolor mind blown just a little. So here's what we're gonna do. As I narrate what I'm doing, you're gonna see little call outs on the screen, little words on the screen. And every time I use a technique that I've taught you earlier in this video, it's gonna flash that technique so you know exactly what I'm using. All right, friends, here we go. I'm using the Holbein watercolor palette. I've got my water jug. And as you can see, my water isn't perfectly clean, but you know what? It's okay. It's okay. But if you need to take a beat, clean your water. I'm using Academy watercolor paper still. I am going to start with the 3/4 inch flat wash brush, and I am going to paint in clean-ish water. Big teardrop leaf. You're going to see the shape of this a little better once I start to add color, so don't panic. And just pick a green you love. Pick a green you love. I know I'm probably going to get some angry comments about the state of my water, but I like to show that we don't need to be entirely precious about our water all the time. That dirty water isn't always going to make or break your painting. But anyway, another leaf. That one I did just a little bit more squat. Going to the 1/2 inch dagger right in there with some darker green. If you don't have a pre-mixed darker green, just add a little bit of red to the green you do have. Adding some water here, pushing back on that darker green I just added. This is a great time, friends, to reshape. If you're not 100% happy with the shape of your leaf, reshape a little bit. All your edges are wet. Add a little more pigment, a little more color, and switch up that shape, refine. You might be wondering about that white space up in the leaf, the first leaf that I created. That's going to get filled in. That's going to not be, we're certainly not going to neglect that area. But as you paint and you're in the moment, you might find spots like that that don't get, quote, painted in right away. And it's okay. Don't let them dry completely, but don't worry about it too much. Now let's talk about the size of the paper. If this is new for you, I'm working like 12 by 12 inch. Don't feel like you have to work that big. Use what you have for sure. You can scale all of this down. Also, you could work on a bigger paper and just not fill the whole page. Grabbing a little blue. I actually got 3 blues on my brush there. And if you're curious about the way that I grab multiple colors all at once, you might want to watch this video. It's a cool one. I do a lot of mixing on the page. I'll pick up multiple colors at a time from my palette. And the palette gets messy, but not as messy as you think. All right, press, drag a little bit and lift. Press, drag a little bit and lift. Press, drag a little bit and lift. We're making a cluster, and then press, drag, and twist as you lift. Press, drag, and twist as you lift. And look at this. I'm creating some direction. I've got a spray of leaves that are going up and curving down just by changing the angle of my brush. Now I've got too much pigment on there, so I got a little water on my brush, and I'm pulling back some of the color and blotting on my paper towel. Can do that right away. And the secret sauce to this particular style of painting, this particular technique, the minute you add clean water to an area, do a little bit of lifting and add a little last touch of clean water to that area, it automatically, naturally just softens, diffuses, and blends everything together. It's a lovely little hack. Look how I'm getting into the nooks and crannies of those leaves. They're smallish leaves, and I'm using a not so smallish brush, but I'm using the tip of that 1/2 inch dagger, and wow, you can get a lot going on. Yes, I'm already grabbing my liner brush because I want to get some structure in here with this little spray of leaves, and I'm connecting them with the slightest, wispiest line just to give them some direction and some structure, grabbing 2 greens and a little bit of turquoise on the brush. And I'm going right in to sketching with my liner brush. Friends, there's no rules here. You don't have to slowly build up color from light to dark. You don't have to do all the washy stuff first and then build up your detail. I felt like doing this. I felt like sketching into my painting right away. I have my number 2 round brush and I'm just filling with a little bit of yellow on that brush, filling in. And when I'm doing that, I'm filling and I'm pulling color from that line I just made with my liner brush. And those 2 colors are just diffusing together beautifully. You might be wondering, Kristy, do you have a plan where this composition is going? No, this is something I do all the time. I love painting leaves, and I will just start with 1 or 2 big leaves and build out from there. So you don't always have to have a plan. Cat's tongue brush, and I'm just adding in some very short, quick, bouncy movements on the top edge here around the point. Just adding in some dimension, pushing that paint around with a little bit of water. I am not a realistic painter, friends, but when my paintings are all said and done, they're definitely recognizable. They've got an edge of realism, but I kind of embellish on reality. And so when I'm painting like this, I'm not always thinking of, okay, what direction is the sun coming from? And no. Now, there's nothing wrong with painting that way, but it's not the only way to paint. And it's not the only way to get a recognizable, finished painting. Okay, I did a little downstroke there, press, drag, long, and lift. Press, drag, long, and lift. And I'm repeating with just the water on my brush. And look at that. Gorgeous, gorgeous light to dark I'm getting so effortlessly. I love to remind you that you can do the press, drag, and lift technique with a downstroke or an upstroke. Now, friends, the composition aspect of this might feel very overwhelming to you. I'm just repeating the same kind of technique over here, 1 dark stroke, and then blending it out with water as I go and shape the leaf. But back to what I was saying, you might feel overwhelmed with the compositional aspect of this. And I'm going to tell you something, a little hack. Follow compositions that other people have made. Now, don't copy others' artwork, but go on Instagram, follow floral designers. In my last video, this one here, I mentioned how I love a floral designer. Her name is Tulipina. She's incredible. And you can follow the compositions of others. Look up floral styling. Google that, find it on TikTok. Search that tag or hashtag on Instagram, floral styling, and you will find so many beautiful compositions that you can turn into paintings that allow you to not worry about composition yet. You don't have to worry about all the things all at once. I'm adding a little bit of turquoise into my damp leaf here just because I think it's pretty. I'm still using that 1/4 inch dagger, and I'm just bossing this paint around. I always say watercolor is like that living medium. It still lives on the page because when the page is wet and you're adding wet pigment, everything blends around. And I also say that you should kind of succumb or surrender is a better word, to watercolor and let it do what it wants. But at the same time, there's a caveat. You can bully around watercolor just a little bit. With more pigment and more water, you can become the boss, just a little bit. I went along the edge there, add a little bit of darker pigment. It felt a little too scratchy, too textury, so I added a little water right next to it to soften it up. And remember what I said about reshaping. Whenever your leaves, whatever you're painting is wet or damp, you still have the opportunity to reshape. So I'm getting a little precious about the very tip of that leaf. I want it to look like it's like turning and twisting just a little bit. So moving on with the 3/4 inch wash brush, getting a little water and pigment on there. I am holding it almost perpendicular, so you'll be able to see what I'm doing in a moment. Just creating a few bolder stems. I want this to feel, I've decided now, finally, I want this to feel like a spray of leaves, almost like a little nosegay, a little bouquet of leaves. So I'm creating that cluster of stems towards the bottom. I'm going back in with that 1/4 inch dagger, bullying around that leaf. I don't know know why I'm obsessing over that one leaf, but it needs to stop for the love. Goodness gracious. You may be wondering about my water pot here. This is a custom pot that I had made. The center well obviously is for super duper dirty water. And then my clean-ish water is on the outer rim, and I love it. But you can accomplish the same thing with 2 containers. So now I clean my brush really well because I'm going for yellow, and yellow is such an easily contaminated color. And I just scrubbed in some shapes, some bouncy, loopy, scratchy shapes, kind of stemming from one of those stems that I just painted in. And now I go right in at the base of that yellow where all the yellow stems converge and added orange. And that yellow was pretty wet, so I'm already seeing like, oh, dang, that is pretty, that's a little out of control. So I'm probably going to come back to that. Press, lift at all different angles. I'm creating some yellow filler flowers here at the top. Grab different yellows, press and lift. There's no drag on that particular stroke. It's just a press and a lift at different angles. All right, I'm going back to that orange, friends, because she got out of control. My goodness. So I got a little clean water on my brush, and I'm going to push back and blot. Push back, scoop up, and blot. Push back, scoop up, and blot. And we got things back in control right away. These are the kind of moments, I just want to point this out. These are the moments that have potential for creative panic, where things are bleeding too much and you're like, oh my gosh, or you accidentally drop a few splotches of color on your page and you're like, oh my goodness, I'm done. I've ruined it. But these are the moments that I actually want you to, instead of panic, I want you to take a breath and realize that there's always a way to fix it. There is always, I'm going to be bold, there's always a way to fix it. I'm adding a little orange to the yellow cluster flowers at the top here. I made sure to kind of pull out some of the color from them so they weren't too wet this time. Going in with my liner brush and creating some stems with just a dark green. You do what you have, do what you love, do what's in the crevice of your palette. Don't be precious about it. The one thing to make this look successful is to just have all those stems radiating from a single point, and it will then look like a little spray in a bouquet. Going down to the first flower, the out of control flower, and creating a little bit of a thicker stem because this is a larger flower. So I'm giving it a little bit of a stronger head, a couple extra lines, and bringing it down into that main stem area. I even painted, look at that, a few little thicker leaves at the base. Gorgeous. And I did that with my liner brush, just a little extra pressure on the liner brush. Now I'm adding some water into this yellow flower because I just want a little more blendy blend, and I'm refining the shape because I can. Scooping out some of that. I feel like I want some highlight. Scooping out with a clean brush and blotting. Scooping out and blotting. Friends, are you having a good time? I'd love if you subscribe to the channel. I'm just going to come out and say it. I don't want you to miss anything. I really appreciate this community. I love the conversations we have in comments. I reply to all comments. So give this video a boop, a like, and hit that subscribe button. I'm going back to sketching with my liner brush. I'm a big fan of like droopy moments in my paintings, like viney, like vines that are creeping and crawling and drooping in areas. And a really wonderful way to get that effect is by sketching with your brush. And then I'm going in and filling with just whatever's on this number 2 brush, filling in with a little bit of water and letting the color from the outline from the sketch that I did of the leaf blend in. And it's just such a fun effect. It's a way to keep things interesting in your painting. I'm a big fan of painting leaves in a couple different ways throughout one composition. I just think it keeps things really interesting. Now we can start to see this beauty come into life. And if you're painting along with me, I just want to say bravo. I just want to say bravo. This is a lot. This lesson is jam-packed with information, with aha moments, I hope. And so if you're still here with me, kudos to you. Kudos to you. I went in with that 3/4 inch wash brush, added just a few little scratchy strokes at the bottom just to suggest a few leaves. Now I'm grabbing a coral color that's pre-mixed on my palette and adding it over top of the orange on all of these yellow flowers. If you don't have a coral, mix together an orange and a pink, an orange and a red, and a little white even. Or if you don't have coral, don't worry about it. And I just like, it gives it a little softening vibe. The orange is a little bright. Okay, so at this point, I would suggest letting your painting dry just a smidge. Not to the point of totally being dry, but to the point of damp. You can walk away, grab a coffee. You could use a hair dryer, but be careful because crazy things can happen. Okay, so here you notice as things dried, I had a little bit of a weird splotchy moment. I'm just going to add a little bit of clean water right over top and blend, blend, blend. Because honestly, this painting hasn't been sitting for a long time. But if you were to discover one of those blotches and your painting was sitting for a couple hours or days, you might have to work a little bit harder to remove that kind of hard edge. Just taking that 1/2-inch dagger with a darker olive green on there. If you don't have a pre-mixed olive green, just take a little bit of green, blue, and red, even a little yellow, and you'll get something pretty darn close. And adding a few splotches on the underbelly of that very first big leaf. Now I'm going in, press, drag, lift, a little bit of a curve as I drag, mirror that, press, drag, lift, but I'm not mirroring it the whole way. There we go. I just want to add a few more leaves up here, grabbing my liner brush, adding a few more stems in here. Oh, look at that. Gorgeous. Right through that leaf. Even though that leaf is damp, it's okay. It'll diffuse and give just the softest look, but there we go. A little more sketching, a few more stems. I just want to exaggerate this kind of vine effect that I have going because I really love it. I really love it. Sorry with my hand placement, but just know when my hand is like that in a painting, it means I'm holding my brush almost perpendicular to the page. Going back to the cat's tongue because I want a little more control and filling in some of these sketchy leaves with a yellow. This yellow is a little bit more like a mustard yellow, so if you don't have a pre-mixed, just take whatever yellow you have, add a touch of brown, you'll be good to go. This is really coming together. Remember to compliment yourself, friends. If you're new here and you don't know what I mean by compliment yourself, I always refer to this video. It's a good mindset habit to start establishing in your art journey. I'd highly recommend watching it. Now I'm using the 1/4-inch dagger to add in some line work. Remember, you don't have to just use the liner brush for the line work. Love it. Light hand, just the right amount of paint and water on the brush, and you'll be able to get a nice gliding line. Okay, friends, I'm grabbing the 1/2-inch dagger and I'm just correcting a little blobby. I like to keep it real with you so you can see the real life little oopsies that happen during a painting experience and how to fix them. I'm taking a damp, clean brush and I'm blending some of those dark marks that I added a few moments ago. Just remember, your wet page is an opportunity. The damp page is an opportunity. Until things dry, you have all the control and you can change. And yes, I did just add green, peach, red, and pink to my brush to create this gorgeous dark color for the veins on this leaf. Don't be afraid to get a little creative with the colors you use in your leaves. Because I don't know about you, but when I go into like a plant shop, I'm just marveled by the amount of color that is in some of the most gorgeous houseplants that are out there. And they're not all just greens and yellows and ivories. There's some gorgeous red veins and purples. And so just get creative. Get creative. This is your domain. This is your little world that you're creating. Look how beautiful that is with the red veins. I love it. I'm still working through that little splotchy weird moment on this leaf. So I'm just keeping an eye on it as I work through the painting. Little bit of scrubbing here just to keep things smooth as it dries. You have to, watercolor, it lives on the page. I've mentioned it before. So something to keep in mind is to just keep an eye on some troublesome spots as you're working through a painting. If you know you've got a weird splotch that's starting to dry or whatever the case may be, keep an eye on them. As long as those areas are damp, you're still going to be able to work and kind of correct in those areas as you paint. Going back with my liner, picking up a little bit of orange. And I want to detail into this larger yellow flower. And I'm going to radiate the detail lines from the center, fan them out. I want to define the petals separately. I want this to feel like they're separate petals. So this is essentially becoming a side view flower. And I'm using a darker color because I really want it to show up. But if you're more subtle in terms of your aesthetic, use just a darker yellow, not necessarily an orange like I'm using. You can also start that line work from the outer edge of the petal inwards. It just doesn't create as effortless a look. You have to be a little bit more careful with how you place the line work brush strokes when you're going from the outer edge of the petal inward. A little bit of cat's tongue action because I'm going to blend some of those areas that I felt were a little bit awkward. That's the thing. If you have some line work or some areas of your painting and you kind of are second guessing your initial decision, your initial placement of brush strokes, just go in that area with a little clean water and blend it out, and it just becomes a shadow. Done. Beautiful. Remember what I said earlier, a lot of white space is not a bad thing. You don't have to feel like you have to fill the whole page. All right, I've got a dark green on my liner brush, and I'm finally going into that original leaf. She's my focal point, and I'm adding some line work. I am letting the paint run out. I'm pressing down right about at the middle of the stroke to get some thickness, and I am still consciously following the contour of that leaf. A little bit of green, a little bit of brown. I've got a lot of pre-mixed greens on this palette, and look at that curve. Don't feel like all of your line work brush strokes need to be the same shape, direction, or thickness. Mix it up a little bit. This is nature that we're trying to capture here, friends, and nature is the queen of variety. All right, now that splotch on this leaf is pretty well managed. I mean, I can still see it. I'm sure now you see it now that I'm calling it out. But once we get in there and add a little love and excitement, she's going to disappear. All right, I've got a little bit of a brown, do like a raw umber, an ochre, or something like that. A little bit of green. See how I mix it up? I'm always grabbing something different. And I strategically placed this line work just over that weird splotchy area to even further camouflage it. Beautiful. That worked out really well. I'm pleased. A little bit of extra leafy bottom of this bouquet work down here. This was more of just a glide and lift with my 1/2 inch dagger. Can you believe it, friends? We're here. We used flooding, ombre, lifting, scrubbing, and line work. And now we can see how they all work together. Oh my gosh. What a blast. So I want you to hit me up in comments right now if you're energized, if you're the least bit mind blown, if you're like, what just happened? Any of the emotions, I want you to hit me up in comments and say, what? Question mark. And of course, ask me any questions that you have because I'm sure you're going to have a lot. I hope you have a lot. Let's keep this conversation going.
After having these videos live for the last year plus at the time of recording this, the questions I get asked the most are having to do with this brush, the dagger brush. This is my Queen Bee Art for Joy's Sake 1/4 inch dagger. And for those just getting into watercolor, and even sometimes those that have been doing it for a while, it can be a little bit of a conundrum. So it is basically a brush that has a really unique shape. It has a curved edge that's shorter. It has a long edge that's longer and kind of very straight. And it has just a beautiful 1/4 inch kind of width or girth, however you want to describe it. And my brush in particular is made out of synthetic bristles, which gives it that bounce and doesn't require you to reshape it as I am here. But it actually does not require reshaping after you press into the paper. It snaps right back to its original shape. So that is the dagger. Not all daggers are created equal. Some are softer, made out of natural bristles. They don't snap back into shape. One of the techniques that I use often in the mastermind that you're watching today is what I call press, drag, and lift. And used in a variety of ways, it can create that classic leaf shape. But folks often get hung up on why, when I create that same stroke, does it not look like yours? And there could be a couple reasons why. Number one, your drag is too quick. When your drag and lift is too quick, you're going to get a blunt edge. Let me show you the difference. Press, slow drag, and a gradual lift is going to give you that nice point. And then we'll just repeat that on the top side and have them meet together. But the key there, 100%, the key there is a slow drag, gradual lift. If either of these are too quick, too abrupt, you're going to get that. The other action that a lot of folks don't get right off the bat, which is totally normal, is the twisting of the brush, the wiggle. As you create that press, drag, and lift, you can twist the brush in between your fingers and then go back to that gradual lift to finish that nice point. And there is a lot of that happening, and it's very nuanced, and it might not be something that in my videos I always verbalize, but there's a lot of that going on. So let's just look at this again. And I want you to pay attention to what's happening with the intersection of my fingers and the brush handle. Press, twisting, twirling, and then that slow lift. Even at the end, I did one last twist, but a very light pressure. And then you can go right next door. Same thing. But this rule here, if I ever was going to get on a rule, it would be slow drag, gradual lift, no matter what. Now, there are times when a fast drag is helpful and a non-gradual lift is helpful. It may be for creating palm-like shapes or just general filler. But if you want that classic leaf shape, you definitely need to do the slow drag, gradual lift. And you can get such unique shapes to your leaves just by enacting that little twist as you drag. How do we fix cauliflowering? Cauliflowering is something that looks a lot like this. To some of us, it's gold. We love it. Cool texture, all the things. Others are just like, absolutely not. Never. Tell me how to fix it. Before we can talk about fixing it, let's talk about why it happens. Basically, it is where two different environments kind of crash together. So it could be a lot of water in a mix coming into contact with not so much in another mix. It could be a color that starts on a damp page and not a lot of paint necessarily, that comes into contact with a completely dry brush technique somewhere else. So basically, it's when things across the page, across a surface, within a particular shape that you're trying to fill with color, when all of that isn't smooth. Smooth when it comes to the amount of water on your brush, the amount of water on your page. It can even be affected by how much humidity is in the air or lack thereof. That's why it's so daggone easy for cauliflowering to happen. And you can see here, just in those first few moments, it's already starting to happen here. Most likely, we're going to see a bunch of it going on here. So, more than likely, you're not going to be able to avoid it in all cases. One of the ways that you can be more mindful, especially if you're looking for a very smooth transition from one color to another, is to have more of a damp brush, not a wet brush. When that brush is getting near the dripping stage where it's super juicy with color and water, you're creating an environment that's just ripe for cauliflowering. And you can immediately see the difference. This was done with a dry page, damp brush, and you can immediately see it's maintaining more of a smooth transition. Whereas here and here and here, it was all different. I wet the page first here, so wet page. Wow, that is interesting handwriting. I had a very soupy, drippy brush here, and it's creating all sorts of craziness. You can even see right here, good heavens, where the crazy soupy brush is banging up next to my damp, more carefully applied color wash. We're getting cauliflowering. So, biggest tip, keep the brush only damp. Now let's talk about fixing it once it happens. There are going to be a couple of factors that really inhibit your ability to necessarily fix this issue. Number one, how staining is the paint that you used? A lot of pigments are high staining, meaning basically, according to Kristy science, once they hit the page, they kind of almost create a form of a chemical bond with the paper, and they very much do not want to move anymore. You put them down, they're done. They're ready to settle in, and that's that. Now, as you can see here, this particular combination of blues that I used in this painting aren't highly staining because I was able to take a just damp brush and moderate sweeping, even pressure, and I was able to kind of pick up some of that paint and smooth and move it around the surface. Now, as this dries, it can still be impacted by what's going on in the air, in the room you're painting in. Do you have a fan on? Do you have a heater on? So you're going to want to watch it and continue, like right here, cauliflowering. Continue to blend with a just damp brush, but watch, watch, watch. Okay. Now, maybe you have a stubborn spot and you just can't lift it. You're not getting a good smoothing effect with the technique we talked about here. And like I said, just watch it. Your options now are to go darker. Get a little bit of a dry brush version of the color on the page and go over top of the area that's cauliflowering, making your darkest stroke centered right on top of the area that's bothering you, the cauliflower, and then with a just damp brush and not a lot of color on that brush, you can blend out from that area. And as you can see, that's a great way to start covering up a cauliflower, especially if it's just being stubborn. I know the red in my palette here is very, very staining, for example. So if this had been a red sky, I don't know why it would have been a red sky. I know right off the bat, it would have been extremely difficult to get that cauliflower in red to move. But here, not too shabby. But as you can see, this is a great way, and you can see I'm just blotting my brush when I go off camera here on a paper towel. Just damp brush, watch it, watch it, watch it. As it dries, you can see it's just wanting to cauliflower. It's just wanting to cauliflower. But the key again here is a just damp brush. And you're going to feel more friction as you make a stroke with a damp brush. It may feel a little like, oh, am I ruining my brush? But trust me, you're not. You might be wondering, how old is this painting? And that is a good thing to wonder because that can impact how easily you're going to be able to blend paint that's already been applied. But in most cases, it doesn't affect it too much. For example, this painting is about a week old, but the color I used wasn't high staining. If this painting had only been a day old, but I had used a high staining color like that red I mentioned, it still would have been very difficult to smooth blend and kind of remove some of the paint in an effort to smooth everything out. Now, remember, friends, that was a lot of information. I am all about you getting into comments and asking me more questions. Give me specific scenarios where you were feeling really uncomfortable and you just need a little bit more information on how to fix those cauliflowers. I'm happy to help.
So it's all about wet on dry. And to be honest, this technique is my favorite, and it's the one I use 90% of the time when starting a painting. And honestly, I think it's highly underrated. Okay, we have 6 rows, 2 columns. Let's get into it. At the very top, I am doing clean, wet on dry. So it's basically water on your brush, you paint it without any pigment on the dry paper. And then immediately you drop color in, and we're in the whole wet on wet dimension. But I felt like I needed to bring this one up because sometimes you forget that you can just paint the page with clean water, and that can be the beginning to an incredible painting experience. And today, friends, each column, row, whatever you want to call it, we're going to make a series of S-curves, petal shapes, simple downstrokes, and more S-curves. Now you're going to want to stick around because once I've gone through all of the variations of the wet on dry technique, I'm going to be going into a whole painting where I'm going to call out every technique I use. Friends, I gotta let you in on a little secret. This is really also a lesson. It's like 2 birds, 1 stone. You know the deal? This is also a lesson in water control. Okay, so there's actually a lot going on in this chart. Let me explain. First, we're examining what happens with a wet brush on a dry page and a wet brush on a damp page. But within each of those, we're also looking at a damp brush, an actual wet brush, and then a juicy brush. So increasing amounts of water and or pigment at each stage. Okay, first column, damp on dry. And my goal in this column is to create a really soft sheer color. So I'm loading up with a little bit of blue and quite a bit of water, and then I'm gonna dab on a paper towel so my brush isn't super soggy. And an S-curve, I am using a round brush, use what you have. And then a few petal shapes, just so you can get a sense, a feel for how the brush drags on the paper. And sure, let it run out a little bit, but load up again. Try to get a similar pigment load, a similar dampness on your brush as when you started. This is a great exercise in water control, and you really start to understand what your pigments do depending on the state of the paper and the amount of water on your brush. Purposely changing up to a different color, trying this out, seeing how it feels, and a few downstrokes and a few S-curves. Next up is wet on dry. Classic. So this is kind of a 50-50 type of situation in terms of pigment to water ratio, and the goal is the next step in color intensity. So use your palette, blend your chosen pigment with the amount of water that you think you need, try to find your 50-50 spot, and continue on in that row with the same strokes. Now that you're paying attention, very focused on how much water and how much pigment is on your brush, you're going to be very sensitive to when the color starts to get more intense. For example, that third petal from the left is definitely got more pigment going on, a little bit less water than the others. Now, friends, you know I love to make up my own names for techniques that have been around for a long time, or techniques that are kind of in the shadows in traditional watercolor that I feel need their own name. And next up is one of just those. Juicy on dry. As you can imagine, this is going to be your most intense option. So imagine what a juicy brush would feel like. A good amount of water and a lot of pigment. You want heavy pigment load. So you're going to be digging into your palette, your half pans, however you store your colors, with a very wet brush and really getting that half pan, that pile of pigment on your palette, really syrupy. And so then you can pick up all that pigment and lay down your strokes, and you're gonna see your most intense color so far in this exercise. It should glide on the page. You shouldn't feel a drag on the page. It's about that time. Friends, if you're enjoying this lesson and you're getting value from this, please give the video a boop, that's a like, and it really helps out my channel. Also, let's head into comments. Let's chat about this. Which of these three, damp on dry, wet on dry, or juicy on dry, shocked you the most and why? Now, while I typically start any painting with the first three techniques, the next three are where, for me, the magic really lies. We're going to repeat each technique, but on a damp page instead of dry. So go ahead with a super clean brush and fill that first row with clean water. You don't want it to be a puddle or soggy, but you want it to be wet enough that when you add color, it's going to start to diffuse. Now, load your brush with your blue or whatever color you've chosen. Same idea. You want a really soft color, so you want a good amount of water and not so much pigment. And look, friends, look at the gorgeous soft diffusion of pigment that happens when you paint that soft color, that low ratio of color to water on your brush into a damp page. Don't forget to dab on a paper towel just a little bit if you're feeling like you've got too much water on the brush before you lay down your strokes. And we're just repeating the same strokes here: S curves, petal shapes, down strokes, and more S curves. Next up, friends, we have wet on damp. And if you remember, this is more of your 50-50% ratio of water on the brush to pigment. So get that row nice and damp. Remember, you don't want a puddle or your color's not going to do the cool magical diffusing stuff that you want it to do. Load up your brush 50-50 and get to it. And see, that second petal had a lot more pigment on the brush than water. Definitely wasn't a 50-50, and it shows. It's darker. Not bad, just is what it is. That's what I love about this exercise. It really opens your eyes when you're hyper-focused on how much pigment, how much water, and on what kind of surface you're painting on. You learn so much. But you're learning it in a way that you don't have to stress out about. You're not painting a painting. You're not trying to make something look real, all the while learning all the good stuff. You're just making fun marks on the page. Now, don't forget, we are going to go ahead and paint the painting soon, but I promise it's going to be super lighthearted. You'll have fun. All right, last but certainly not least on this chart is juicy on damp. And I got to tell you, friends, this one is where my jam is at, okay? So remember, you're gonna load up that brush. You want that color in your palette to be syrupy. If you need to spray your palette down again and wait 30-40 seconds to let it juice up, by all means. And you see now, this is where the pigment is its strongest, very much like juicy on dry, but because it's on damp, your edges are immediately feathering out into a whisper, and it is so gorgeous. Now also take a moment to look back at the previous two rows and look at how much the color spread, and just make a mental note of that, because it's important for you to know, based on how damp your paper is, how much that color travels before it dries in place. All right, friends, head into comments. I need to hear which of the 6 techniques was your favorite, and do you envision using the most in your painting? Okay, and while you're at it, if you haven't already, give the video a boop. It's a like. I appreciate it so much. As promised, we actually are going to make some art today, and I didn't know what to paint in the moment, so I literally just grabbed this scarf off the back of my chair in the studio. It's pretty. It gives me some inspiration. I'm definitely not going to try to be realistic about it and completely recreate it, but it gives me a springboard for this painting. Friends, I'm not going to teach you how to paint what I'm about to paint today. I'm simply going to call out one of the 6 techniques as I use them, so you can understand how these techniques fit into the realities of the art you might be using them in. Technique name flash up on the page, so if you want to pause and really examine what's going on, you can.
Contaminated colors. This is one that comes up across so many videos, and I just want to talk about it a little bit. Here is my pink from the Art for Joy's Sake palette. And I want to show you, this is definitely, I mean, all of my palettes get contaminated very easily. And I want to show you what that really means in real life, working with the colors. So, as you can see, my first stroke here, comparatively speaking, had a lot more purple going on. But very quickly, I kind of burnt off that purple. All right, now let me show you again with another color that's often getting contaminated in my palette. This is the blue from my palette. Let's keep digging in there. The blue. And you can kind of see, if you're familiar with my palette at all, this is definitely looking a little bit more green. This is a double dip that I do all the time. I go from green to blue, blue to green. And we'll do one more. All right. Here's where we started. Just slightly more green, very quickly. Maybe not quite as quickly as this burn off. We got to our more pure blue. Overall, though, what I really want you to notice, knowing what you know of me, and maybe you know nothing of me, but know this: I'm a messy painter. I double dip with dirty brushes all the time. And I'm most often going to pink to purple, purple to pink, blue to green, green to blue, always yellow to blue, yellow to pink. And these colors actually don't look that dirty. And my point in saying all this and showing you all this is to hopefully dispel some of that worry. Let's do it again with the fluorescent. Yellow is a notorious color for getting dirty very easily for obvious reasons. So we're starting out, we can see that it definitely looks dingy. And I can see right into this pan. It is dirty as all get out, right? But very quickly, even the dirtiest pan in my palette is cleaning up its act super quick. So the moral of the story, I think, friends, is that you just have to worry about it a lot less. Because that is coming from the queen of messy painting, the queen of double dipping, showing you that just with a few strokes with clean water, you can bring back your half pan that may have been slightly contaminated by even the most aggressive double dipping, and you're back to zero so easily and quickly. So the moral of the story is, don't worry about it too much. I promise. I get so many questions about water control. You can even see here, friends, how much water should be on my brush when I'm picking up the paint. These are all incredible questions, and it does come down to water control. But something we sometimes forget is that water control not only has to do with how much water is on your brush, but how much water is on the paper and how those two elements intersect. Now, I did get so many questions about this. I created an entire video about it, and guess what? It's included later on in this mastermind, so stay tuned. But this is the Fast and Loose primer. I want you to think about painting with a brush onto paper, kind of like a dance. There's two partners. There's the paint and the water on your brush. Okay, maybe three. And then there is the amount of water or paint already on your paper. And then we need to think about pressure, moisture, and paint. So let's look back at this first stroke I made. Lots of paint here. And as I created the stroke, dragging it across horizontally, I let up on my pressure. Now, conversely, on the bottom, at the end of the stroke, I had less paint on my brush, but I used more pressure. And in this case, I ended up with a dry brush technique because I didn't have a lot of paint left at the end of the stroke, and I was using a lot more pressure from my brush onto the paper. I know that was a lot of words, and you're probably like, I'm never going to get this, but you are. Every time you sit down to paint, every time you use maybe too much water for a given situation, you are going to learn something. Look at how much water is on my brush now. I created this really soupy puddle in my palette, and you can almost see the paint dripping off of the brush. Now here's the stroke. A lot of color intensity at the beginning of the stroke, but as I drug it across horizontally, I immediately got texture. And these are the kind of exercises you have to run through. Make strokes. Pay attention to the pressure you're using. Pay attention in that stroke to how much paint is on your brush. And even make notes after you've created a stroke, much like I did on the screen here. It can be so beneficial. And these kind of little interludes where you take the time to make a stroke, to observe what you've done, and to make notes about it, that's going to get that information into your head. And every time you go to paint, you're going to build up that kind of resource or reservoir of knowledge. And at some point down the road, your brain is going to be like, oh, yeah, I get this. I remember this. Let's try this again. Now, remember, the goal here, I'm trying to make a smooth line. And I don't think I mentioned that earlier. I'm trying to make a smooth, evenly covered line. And this stroke is definitely more balanced between pressure and moisture. So this idea of painting for the point or the exercise of evaluating what you've done might be a new concept, because when we think often about painting, we're going to create a painting, we're going to finish it, and it's going to be pretty and it will be worthy of hanging up on a wall. But now, as I begin to paint this leaf, I am being very mindful of how much water is on my brush, what the result I'm getting is based on how much pressure I'm applying to the paper. And I'm going to make some notes. I'm going to evaluate what I've done here. You can ask yourself at this point, is it smooth like you thought it would be? Is it too textured? Is the paint not looking very sheer? Is it looking too gloppy? All those kind of things. So I want you to try this. I want you to paint just a few swirls, and if they turn into leaves, great. And don't go in with too many expectations, except for maybe I want to create a leaf shape and have it be pretty smooth across the whole surface of the shape. And then I want you to observe. Here I'm thinking, why does this feel heavy? And then you've asked yourself the question, now try to answer it. In that case, honestly, I just probably had a little bit too much paint on my brush and not enough water. Now here we go with the third leaf. I used a little bit of a different technique. That's not really the point here. The point is I've got another leaf shape down, and it's feeling really like chalky to me again and heavy. And so my observation, my evaluation would be, why? Did I use too much pressure? Did I use too much water and too much paint? I think I did. So this second leaf, I did a little differently. I've used a lot of words here to explain a concept that could be a little tricky. Remember, we've got more on this coming up in the mastermind, but always think about the amount of moisture and paint on your brush, and then how much pressure you're applying to the paper. And don't forget to note your successes, things that you like. Like, I really love the way the grayish blue melted into that pink. Go ahead and circle things that you love as well, and try to remember what you were doing there to create those moments that you actually like. Maybe the biggest lesson here is that we have to stop always wanting to paint, putting brush to paper to get some fabulous result. I know, it's probably hard to hear, but so much joy can be found in exercises like these. You can kind of get lost in this page of your own handwriting and brushstrokes and paint droplets and imperfections that are really becoming your visual roadmap to becoming better, to becoming more confident, and to land in a place where you feel like you're making solid progress.
I was recently asked a question in a one-on-one lesson I was teaching that completely baffled me. She said, Kristy, how do I know when I'm no longer a beginner at this watercolor thing? And so I was scrambling in my embarrassment, and I'm hoping she didn't notice, because I really didn't know how to answer this question, and I've been painting for over 30 years. And so I came off with a collected and calm answer that seemed to make sense, something along the lines of, when you've practiced all the techniques and you feel like you're proficient in all of them, then you can combine them successfully and predictably. But I immediately was not happy with my answer. So in today's video, we're gonna go a little bit further. Let's go back to kindergarten, the time when milestones and a sense of traveling through certain steps to proficiency first enters our consciousness. Most of our learning at this point is done through play, but quickly we enter first grade and everything changes. Proficiencies are now at the core of learning, and play is traded for worksheets, drills, and this first grade trajectory continues into our adult learning lives. Very, very quickly we forget how to play. And so when we challenge ourselves to go back to play as adults, I venture to say this is when we're no longer beginners. We're now ex-beginners. But don't go anywhere, because it's not that simple. Moving beyond being a watercolor beginner is really simply about playfulness with the core techniques that we learned in the video I'm linking below. It's about challenging yourself to put a spin on what you've learned, on what has now come to feel comfortable. For today's supplies, you're gonna need your favorite watercolor paper. I'm using Arches Cold Press. Your favorite palette, at least 12 colors I'd suggest, but if you don't have 12, that's fine. And of course, a favorite brush, or even a handful of favorite brushes. I'm gonna be using quite a few from my 2 collections of brushes available. I'm going to be taking you through each of the techniques that I covered in the mastermind video that I've linked below and showing you how to put a spin on them based on 3 factors: wet on dry, wet on wet, and opacity. And then at the end, we're gonna paint the same exact painting we did in the video I've linked below, but we're going to use all of the new technique spins that we've just learned. Let's get to some practice drills. Here we go, friends. I'm just adding some clean water to this section of the chart. And friends, this is a simple chart. I didn't measure. It's just do your thing and have 5 columns. All right, laying some color down. I chose blue. No particular reason, I just like the blue. And we're gonna then choose a different color after rinsing our brush and immediately start to look at some of the differences that happen when we're using the wet on wet technique, or WOW, with 2 different colors. And then rinse your brush again and choose a 3rd color. Friends, what I want you to understand here is that wet on wet, when we first learn, it's more about the wet paper and 1 color and seeing what happens, and then slowly starting to add a 2nd color or more. But what I really want you to do as an intermediate, as an ex-beginner, is understand what starts to happen when you get more than 2, 3 plus colors on the page, because it's a lot of magic. The other thing I want you to take notice of and really remember is what starts to happen when earlier parts of your painting start to dry. So the wet on wet areas that were first wet start to dry, but you're still adding color to them, or at least the perimeters. And you're gonna get a lot of interesting things happening, like I like to say, in the margins. So I want you to notice that as well. So again, as you go through this exercise, I want you to notice a bunch of things about this wet on wet with various colors. I want you to notice how the page is drying and how those different levels of dryness on the page are affecting the way that the color is soaking into the paper. What's happening in the overlaps when there's a really wet on wet area, or when there's a wet on damp area, like what's going on there? Is the color exploding more? And then when everything's dry, I want you to just take that last look and evaluate and kind of burn it into your memory, because you can come back and use some of the things that you learned. So for example, look at some of the interesting things that are happening when I'm adding some more of the opaque watercolor here at the top over that ivory and the blue. That peach is just creating some interesting mixtures, and I can't wait to see what it looks like when it's completely dry. All right, friends, moving on to wet on dry, and I'm going to be using a watercolor sketching technique. Because the thing is, it's not just a certain type of stroke. We see a lot of those medium width leafy strokes, my press, drag, and lift type of strokes. I've got a video linked below if you want to know more about that. But strokes come in all different shapes and sizes, and I think sometimes as a beginner we forget that. But as an ex-beginner, you start to really explore what your brush can do. So then you need to think about, what can the brush do? For example, here I'm using a liner brush and I'm going wet on dry, and I'm literally using my brush to sketch. So what can your brush do when you combine it with some interesting technique combos? And this is what happens. So I'm literally just forcing myself. I keep saying literally a lot. I don't know why. You know what I'm doing. No, I'm kidding. But seriously, use the liner brush to sketch. Pretend you're holding a pencil. It's just the kind of pencil that you have to reload with paint and water every so often. And see what happens. Change up your pressure. Do this wet on dry. You could even make another section of this column and do the same technique, wet on wet, and see what happens. But I want you to start thinking about your watercolor brush as a pencil and how you would use it differently if you were thinking about making linear strokes that bounce along the page, that flow along the page continuously, instead of making thicker strokes that are just kind of a press, a little bit of drag and lift. How can that change? How can that evolve what you've been doing so far in your journey? How can you take this new combination of techniques and let it propel you to the next level? You're seeing a lot of texture here, friends, a lot of whimsy. And so again, take note of that and think to yourself, where could I have used this in a painting maybe that you worked on a week ago or a month ago? Maybe even go back to that painting, friends, and add some of this kind of detailing and see how it feels. As an ex-beginner or entering into the intermediate phase, because I know we like to put names on things and titles on things, you really start to think about the overlapping of techniques. You stop seeing these watercolor techniques as standalones, and you start seeing them as part of an equation, sometimes part of a very long and somewhat complicated equation. And I can tell you from experience, when you start to see your watercolor techniques that way, and you pair that with different brushes and different ways to hold your brushes, oh my gosh, the floodgates of opportunity open wide. Next up, friends, we are looking at the flooding technique. It's one that I named. So we're going to start by laying some color down, and we're going to look at this technique with flooding on dry paper and then flooding on wet paper. Because remember, we want to see all the different facets or personalities of these single techniques that we've been using up until now. So lay down some color. I'm choosing the emerald green from my Art for Joy's Sake palette, and then immediately start pushing or flooding that emerald green area with, I chose a fluorescent yellow, and see what happens when you push some of that color around, when you force some friction onto the page. Does it stain the page? And remember, we started on a dry page, so the color is going to be more intense than if we tried this or started this on a wet page. And we'll see soon what happens when you do some flooding on a wet page. Continue on adding more colors, change up the color family. Right now I've got cool colors. You could go warm. I'm actually experimenting with bringing in some opaques to see what happens. Flooding, you'll immediately now notice it's a way of mixing color on the page instead of mixing it in the mixing tray on your palette. Take note of the intensity. Take note of how the colors start to interact when you push them together, instead of maybe what you're used to, which is stroking them side by side and maybe touching in areas and letting those areas bleed. All right, I'm gonna head right below here with a clean brush full of water, and I'm gonna wet the area to get ready for our next experiment. I'm gonna start by laying down some red. Now this red from my palette is a highly staining red, and so we'll see how it does with the flooding wet on wet. And of course, as expected, that red is juicy and saturated and rich. It's gorgeous. Let's go in now and flood in some of this bright pink. gorgeous. You can immediately see the difference. Now, I'm using a more bold color than I did with my Flood on Dry. So overall, the look is more bold, but you can see the way the colors kind of flood and puddle together is very differently because I started with a damp or wet page. Go ahead and add some opaque watercolor. I'm using this like soft shell pink from my collection. And again, just seeing how I'm almost creating kind of a puddle on the page now. And the colors are acting completely different than when I used the same type of motion and the same pushing around of color as I did earlier with the Flood on Dry. Okay, take a breath here and make note of how the changes are different, how the way that the pigments kind of change and mingle and evolve with one another are different from the Flood on Dry to the Flood on Wet. And you know what? You've made these charts. These are yours. Go ahead if you want and make some notes directly on the charts. I highly recommend keeping these, even if you have an area for inspiration, some type of board in your space where you create. Pin them up for a while so you can definitely use them as reference. What I'm noticing most, the difference here, the Flood on Dry is actually more of a subtle transition from one color to another, even though I use the same type of friction and the same type of movement with my brush. So surprisingly, the Flood on Wet is much juicier, much bolder, because all of the puddles that are being created, it almost looks slightly like marbling, which is so cool. These are the kind of discoveries that you start to unearth as you really continue in your watercolor journey. And also, these are the kind of experiences that you start to log into your intuition. It's not like you're taking notes and being like, I've got to use that intersection of red and purple in my next. No. I mean, you could do that. Maybe we've got some planners here. I mean, I do talk about our procrastination personalities. I'll link that video below, and one of them is a planner. But most of us are going to just enter and log all of this new juicy information into our intuition, especially as we start and continue to use these new technique combinations day in and day out. I gotta ask, who's excited? Because I certainly am. It can be so helpful to do charts like this, don't you think? That really kind of log unique experiences, and then once you've got the chart done once, you can move on to the fun stuff, meaning the actual painting of the paintings. All right, let me know if you agree, if you're having a good time, if you're finding value in this. Head to comments and find a way, whatever way you want to express that you're loving this, and I can't wait to see the comment section for this video. And while you're at it, go ahead and give this video a boop. Friends, that's a like, and it's just that little thumbs up button, and you know what? It really helps out my channel in so many different ways. I appreciate it so, so much. All right, we are moving on to the ombre technique, and the same thing. We're gonna look at ombre on dry, ombre on wet, and then bringing in some different levels of opacity with our watercolors. Remember, we're looking at 3 different details when it comes to these more advanced techniques: wet on dry, wet on wet, and opacity. My self-named technique of ombre is what's traditionally known as pulling. But what I'm about to do here definitely makes it a new technique, because I am going right onto a dry page. And usually pulling involves a very damp kind of environment. So grabbing that pink and then immediately going to the peach right underneath, and the friction of adding the peach just overlapping with the pink starts to blend them together. And then I'm going to continue down with a bright pink. And you'll notice you've got a soft-ish transition between these colors, but it's not super flowy and it's not as soft as a traditional ombre where you use quite a bit more water. But I can imagine so many ways that this ombre effect on dry paper could be so incredibly helpful in different painting situations I've been in. How about you? Can you think of ways that the ombre on dry technique might be really, really helpful? Let us know in comments. Heading into the ombre on wet, and of course I'm going and wetting the page first with super clean water, and I'm going to go ahead with the same colors, the peach, then the pink, or actually I think I switched it up, but close enough. And continue on with the bright pink, and let's see the difference. You can already see the difference here. The transitions are more gradual. They're softer and dreamier. Even with the more intense pink, the transition is a lot more flowy and kind of romantic. Going in with that ivory again, and then of course with the blue. So the differences are definitely more subtle in this particular example, but friends, I'd have to say they're not subtle enough that they don't matter. You can see the soft qualities of the ombre on wet that just aren't as obvious in the ombre on dry. Imagine this, you could start with an ombre on dry, that layer could dry, then you could glaze over top with an ombre on wet, and oh my gosh, did I just blow your mind because I said a lot of words? Be sure to stick around because we're going to be covering glazing really soon. Heading into the lifting technique, friends, and here's what I'm going to do to start this off. I'm going to paint 2 leaves. You can paint your leaves any which way you want. Just the kind of rule of thumb for this particular exercise is make sure there's a couple different colors going on, and maybe make sure that the colors are kind of punchy. I'm using reds and greens and yellows, so there's some opposite color wheel stuff going on, and then let those leaves dry for maybe a minute. Traditionally, we think of lifting as a way to correct mistakes. I want to talk about the idea of positive lifting, where the lifting isn't necessarily to remove something because it's wrong, that the lifting is done to actually reveal something really interesting, really cool, really exciting and evocative in your painting. Let me explain. Better yet, watch what's happening on the page as I'm starting to lift some of that darker emerald green from the underside of that bigger leaf. It's revealing really subtle but obvious textures. And then after that lifting is done, I go ahead right in with that medium olive green from my palette right over top. I glaze it right over top. Don't worry, we're going to talk about glazing. Basically, I add a layer. And look at what happens. Some of those interesting textures that revealed themselves when I did the positive lifting are now even more obvious and even more exciting because I added a glaze of color over top. So I also call this push and pull positive lifting. Push and pull because you push color onto the page, but then you pull it back off to see what color stained the page, what color remained when you pulled most of it off, and what that color did to kind of change the composition or the texture of the paper underneath. It can be really interesting, especially if you lay down some highly staining colors like the red in my palette here. It's staining, it's hard to remove the color once it's down. But when you do remove some of it, some of the most incredible textures reveal themselves. You can see what I'm doing here. It's just so gorgeous. Let's just take a look at the red that I added initially when I created this leaf. I'm lifting it off and it's creating the most lovely velvety peachiness that I haven't seen in a while. I'm pretty excited about it, honestly, as I do this. And then immediately, my surface is now damp, so I can immediately go in and take advantage of that dampness and add some watercolor sketching over top with the tip of my brush in a contrasting color. And I'm gonna see what happens when those two techniques mingle together. Friends, this is the heart and soul of what I'm talking about. When you're an ex-beginner, you start to really explore these intersections and really figure out what they mean for establishing your own style and your own painting sensibilities. Lots of push and pull here happening. I just pushed some additional red there on the left-hand side of that bigger leaf just to see what would happen when all of those layers start mingling together. It's super fun. I'm not sad about it. Going down into this smaller leaf and doing some of the positive lifting. I don't feel like I have a mistake here. I'm not trying to remove something because it's too heavy or ill-placed. I just want to see what texture's happening underneath, what the staining did. Look at that, it's so gorgeous. And of course, it's a great way to add highlights. We know that, we get that. But it's also a really cool way to start playing with texture and pattern, and it's another way to look at your composition. It's just another level of interest that you can control. Okay, friends, head into comments and let me know which of these technique spins so far is your favorite. Is it the multicolor wash in the wet on wet section, the wet on dry with watercolor sketching? Is it the flooding on dry or the flooding on wet, the ombre on dry or wet? Or is it the positive lifting? I'm going to tell you what, it's the positive lifting for me. I can't handle it. And I know I'm probably going to get some backlash because I have a thing for kind of naming my techniques, things that I've come up with. And really, my techniques are a lot of combinations of existing techniques out in the watercolor world. But I find that giving them a name helps us organize them in our brain and therefore makes it easier for us to use them in our daily art journey. So don't go too hard on me. Really, I'm just a creative weirdo and I like to talk a lot. So, you know, I am what I am. But moving on, friends, to the next batch of techniques that we need to put a twist on. And stick around because I'm going to be painting a full composition using all of these techniques. But I'm excited because I'm going to compare it to the same composition I painted in the watercolor beginners video that I've linked below. It's going to be a really cool comparison. All right, friends, we've got two more classic techniques that we're going to put a spin on: scrubbing and line work. And then we're going to move on to additional techniques that are more advanced: glazing and contrast detailing. Let's get into it. So basically, scrubbing is a way that you kind of dab and dash and scrub and scratch your brush across the surface of the paper as a way to add color. And of course, as you can imagine, it reveals a ton of texture. So I'm going to start by adding some opaque scrubs. This is the ivory watercolor from my set, and it by nature is very opaque and it just has beautiful coverage, very velvety. And I'm going to bring in another more opaque color from my palette, the peach. I know it looks like I'm beating up on my brush, but I promise I'm not. I'm using about a medium pressure. I immediately notice that because I'm using a more opaque watercolor, I'm getting a lot more coverage than I would expect with this scrubbing technique, even though I don't have a ton of water on my brush. Let's move on with a clean brush to a more sheer traditional watercolor pigment and use the same technique. And I've got a very similar amount of water on my brush. And as you can see, I'm getting a lot more texture. I probably had a bit more water on my brush for the first opaque exercise in this section, but the difference is not that big. But the visual difference is huge. Now, moving on to scrubbing on wet. And of course, I wet my page first. And I'm going right in with this emerald green, and you can immediately see the difference. It's very similar to the effect of the opaque watercolor, but with the sheerness of a traditional pigment. And I really love the three different kind of looks that we're getting here. I think this is so powerful and holds so much promise for your future paintings. All right, let me know, do you feel the same? Do you feel like there's a lot of opportunity in this particular column so far? Let me know in comments. And while you're at it, go ahead, give the video a boop, that's a like. And you know what, if you wanna not miss any of my videos upcoming, you wanna hit that little bell icon as well, because that'll make sure that you get a notification whenever I post a new video. Moving on to line work, another classic technique, but I'm gonna explore it 3 different ways using my 1/4" dagger brush. I'm gonna create a really simple, kind of sketchy landscape here, and with my opaque pigments, of course, just so you can see the crispness of the lines and see the coverage when you really start to explore these classic techniques, but with some non-traditional pigment or paint characteristics. What I love about more opaque watercolors is I feel like you get the best of both worlds with watercolor. There's moments, especially when you have more water on your brush, where it feels like traditional watercolor, but somehow creamier still. But then when you have that kind of 50-50 ratio of color to water, you get that beautiful heavy coverage, great for detailing, great for bold shadows. So I just feel like really exploring all these techniques with a different kind of personality of watercolor pigment is so beneficial, so powerful. Now, I also think it's really important for you to start thinking about line work a little differently. It's not just about those thin, flowy, lyrical lines. It's about the different types of lines you can make with all variety of brushes. So it's going to be thick lines and medium lines and undulating lines. And it's not always going to be flowy and lyrical and romantic. Sometimes it's going to be bold and scratchy and staccato. So this is the time to really start exploring what line work means within your own work. And honestly, trying out a lot of different options. And you may not use them all down the road, but just knowing that there's so many options out there can really help propel your artwork on this journey. All right, rinsing my brush and loading up with a more traditional sheer watercolor personality. And I'm just gonna sketch a little bloom with the tip of this number 6 round brush, friends. And I think it's important to switch up your brushes as you're experimenting with these exercises. It's just, there's just all sorts of learning and layers, and we're compounding all of our knowledge here today. So just go for it. And as you can see, the beauty of and the sheerness of a traditional watercolor are shining bright here. You can see through to the paper. You can see the kind of immediate and instant lights and darks that happen. This is what you would expect out of traditional watercolor. If you've been around here for a hot minute, you know that traditionally when I'm speaking of the line work technique, I'm using a liner brush. It's the long and skinny one. And I like to make super delicate, whimsical, romantic, lyrical, all the adjectives type of stroke with that brush. But that's not all there is to line work, and that is exactly the kind of reason we are here today. Now let's move on to line work on wet. Because, oh my gosh, this one is going to probably become your favorite. Wet down that paper and let's get into it. This time around, I'm using a filbert brush, and I'm just gonna start adding some strokes of whatever color. I'm feeling like greens and blues, you do you, boo. All right, and just start adding some press and lift, and that lift is quick, and you're gonna get these gorgeous ocean wavy like marks, and they're going to be softly diffused. Like you can see here, the diffusion is just so delicate and soft, but the stroke and the color intensity is really bold. Oh my gosh, there's so many uses for this. You could use this in an ocean scene, of course, but think about going even lighter, watering down your color and using the same strokes for a background. Heavens to Betsy, I can't even handle my excitement with this one. Are you with me? Are you with me, friends? This is a good one. I'm using kind of an S curve also, that kind of stroke where you make a really soft graduated S. I gotta tell you, this could be a whole exercise. This could be like a meditation. Fill a whole damp page with these kind of strokes, and woo! I gotta stop. We gotta move on because I'm gonna lose it in a very good way. I just want to remind you again, these are your charts. You own this space. Feel free to take some notes, things that you're kind of noticing, things that you don't want to forget. This is your space to do it. And this is also the time to do it because all of the excitement is fresh. And that's when your response to what you're doing is going to be the most accurate and the most excited. And yeah. All right, let's talk about glazing. I've actually done a few videos on this channel about this technique. I'm gonna link them below, but I thought that glazing deserved a real technical moment here. So in preparation for this section, I'm gonna go ahead and just add a bunch of interesting weirdo strokes to this column. You do you can copy me, let's speed through this, and also you wanna let these dry. So let's get on with it. Because the idea of glazing is that we add layers of color and or texture in between a time of drying of those layers. And so, yeah, imagine what we're about to do. Woo, friends, I feel like we need a hot minute to recover from that glazing excitement, but it is time to move on to contrast detailing. Here's the thing, I'm gonna use a number 12 round brush, use what you have, use what you love, and I'm going to just paint some classic press, drag, and lift leaves. Paint the leaves the way you're comfortable painting them. That's not the important part. Get those leaves down, feel free to follow my little micro composition here or just do your thing. But the point is to have these leaves be pigmented enough and still damp or wet enough so that when you finish this up, they're still damp and wet enough. because we're going to be using that to our advantage with this particular technique. This technique starts out as wet on dry, and then when I get my leaves going here, I'm going to start to add a little bit of color to the edge, right where the wet edge meets the dry of the paper. Right on that line. It's going to feel like an outline when you start, but you're not going to do it continuous around the whole silhouette. And then you're going to take your rinsed brush that's damp and make a stroke right down next to that color that you added. And that's basically going to create the most delicious blendy blend, like I did in that first one. And I created this gorgeous blendy blend from a red into the olive green, all the way over to the emerald green. And let's do it again here on this second middle leaf. Look at what's happening. Dot in a little bit of color, dot in a little bit of darkness. Like I did at the top where it was just a darker green. At the bottom, I did a bold red. Just for example's sake, I'm going to continue it down here, a few dabs and dots of a dark green onto that lighter green leaf, and then go right next door with a damp, clean brush and blendy blend. And that, my friends, is what I call contrast detailing. Yes, it's another made-up technique by yours truly. Go easy on me. Friends, this technique is going to be your BFF. I just have a feeling. It's a wonderful way to, number one, add really quick depth and dimension, or really quick shadows. Now let's head back to the glazing section now that everything's had some time to dry. Just to give you an idea, this page of mine has actually dried for about 5 days, not intentionally, and certainly not because you need to dry each layer in between for 5 days, but that's just when I finally got back to it. But I will say this, the longer you let each layer dry, the less disruption you'll see when you add a new layer on top of the old layer. All right, let's get into it. So for this exercise, really we're just going to start laying some additional layers of color over top what we already have. Few things I want you to notice, and you can start then to think about how this would translate into a real life painting. What happens with the undercolor, the first layer, when you apply a new layer of color? So I'm starting here at the top with this peach from the Art for Joy's Sake palette. It's definitely opaque, and you can see it obscures some of the pink. Going right next door with some lines like a rusty red color, and then a big stroke to like fan that color out and spread it out again on top of that original pink. And then let's go in with some creamy ivory and a little bit of fluorescent yellow on the end here and blend that back into that rusty red color where you can still see just a hint of the pink shining through. You can imagine the practical applications of what I just showed you here in a real painting. Mind-blowing. Love glazing. Glazing adds depth, but not in always a traditional way. I love adding unexpected color, like this reddish tone on top of the green, glazing that red over top of the original green of this leafy shape that I created, and then going ahead and blending it in, and then bringing back some of the stronger green from my palette, glazing that over top of the original yellowy green. And look at that, it's so interesting. So don't think of glazing in just the traditional way. I want you to think of it a little differently here, like how I'm adding this really sheer green over top of the pink in that top area that I was first working in. Such an interesting combination where you kind of are muting that pink because of the thin glaze of green that you're adding over top. So move away from just thinking about, okay, I can strengthen an existing color with just a darker shade of that color as the only way to glaze. I want you to think about color theory and opposites and how glazing opposite colors on the color wheel on top of one another can really just level up your painting experience in a big way. If you're curious to learn more about color theory and how it impacts your everyday painting, I'm going to link my video about color theory below. All right, look here, friends. I'm going over top of the blue, glazing on top with some purple and some red, but I'm not glazing the whole area in the same way. So this is another detail to think about with glazing. Often when you think about traditional glazing, you think about glazing the whole area. So if you painted a leaf, let's say, as your first layer, you're going to cover that whole leaf with another color or a vast majority of that leaf. That is my understanding of traditional glazing. I like to think of glazing a little different and adding strokes of additional color in some areas, like this green leaf here that I'm now adding pink and more intense olive green to. But I'm doing it in brush strokes and allowing kind of the gradient glazing effect to shine through, finishing off with a yellowy green to really bring this leaf to life. And then, yeah, I needed to add something really bold, so an emerald green right there on the underside. This is all glazing. And this is really an interesting place to think about the intersection of techniques, which is the whole idea of going from a beginner watercolors to a more intermediate watercolor. As I mentioned it earlier, we think about how these techniques intersect. So we've got kind of line quality, linear detail, the technique that I love, I talk about a lot on this channel, and we're intersecting that with glazing. So glazing isn't just about adding big strokes of color, big fields of color over top of an original layer. It's about adding strokes of additional color over an original layer of watercolor. Thirdly, I want you to think about, of course, opacity. We've been talking a lot about the many facets or personalities of watercolor, and it's something you're really going to pay attention to as you enter into the intermediate phase of your watercolor journey. And now I'm adding some more opaque layers, glazing some more opaque pigment onto a more sheer pigment of my original layer. And that just adds a whole new dimension of excitement. And now I'm just going at it, friends. I'm going back to the top, adding a third layer, another glazing layer of purple here on the left-hand side of that pink area, and then pulling some of the color off with the lifting technique. Remember, it's all about the intersection of these techniques. I've just intersected 3 techniques, and that's where things get really interesting, really exciting. How are we feeling about glazing? Do you think it's going to really elevate your painting journey? Let me know in comments. Just say yes, or if you have a question about glazing, get that in the comments below as well. Moving on to a real painting. We're going to use all of these techniques in an actual composition. And as I go through this painting, I am going to have the techniques that I'm using pop up on the screen as I'm using them. And this is a technique that I used in the first video for watercolor beginners and got such great feedback on. So let's get into it. Here is the original painting that I did in the watercolor beginners video, and I'm gonna link that below as I mentioned, and we're gonna repaint this composition, but with all of the intersecting new techniques, whatever you want to call them, that we've just gone through today. Let's recap. There are 4 details I want you to think about as you exit the beginner phase, become an ex-beginner, and enter into the intermediate phase of your watercolor journey. Number 1, opacity. Start to think about how different personalities of watercolor are going to change what happens on the paper. Whether you're actually using a more opaque watercolor that has additives, or you're just using sheer watercolor but in heavier layers. Number 2, wet on wet, but with multiple colors and layers. And of course, playing around with wet on wet and more opaque watercolor textures. Number 3, wet on dry, but the same applies. I want you to have an experimental spirit with different colors, layering, and watercolor opacity with this technique. And number 4, the most important, is the mingling of techniques. You have all these basics, you feel a certain comfort with them, but now you want to compound on that. Build these techniques, see how different techniques work together. Wet on wet, but with line work, or wet on dry, but with dry brush. Wet on wet, but with contrast detailing. Glazing, but with a flooding technique to start. I mean, there are countless combinations. And this is where things get really interesting in your journey. Let's head into this painting. Just a helpful note at this point, friends, you may be feeling a little overwhelmed right now. And that's okay and honestly to be expected. Here's what I want you to remember. A lot of this compounding of techniques and intersecting and mingling of techniques happens in your gut. It happens in the instinctual moments in a painting, and they're not really always the kind of thing that you can plan or think through completely. So just know that and just lean into the uncomfortableness you feel right now and pour that into the page and being instinctive. I know it feels scary, but you got this. Friends, up until this point, I'm establishing the basic composition. I'm keeping an eye on the original painting, making sure that I'm getting enough of a similarity here, and primarily using wet on wet with multiple colors either on the page or on my brush at the same time. Just a note to remind you that the mingling or compounding of watercolor techniques doesn't or shouldn't happen during all stages of your painting session. Sometimes it's just the beautiful basics. It's important to say here, friends, that there is definitely a gray area with some of these intermingling of techniques. So, where we just painted on that big central leaf, is it line work? Is it glazing? The answer is yes. But it's not really knowing the exact name and when the perfect time is to use the name of that technique. No, it's really just knowing that this arsenal of magical moments is available to you when you just realize how these techniques play with one another, how they shake hands, how they high five, right? So don't worry too much about the naming. Just know that all of this fun playfulness exists.
I get a lot of questions about spraying your palettes, worrying about number one, the integrity of the tin or the palette that you have your colors in. And that's a valid question. So I wanted to kind of prove my point or prove my answer here, which I haven't even started giving you yet, by showing you some of my collection. Now, obviously, some of these have been used a lot more heavily, like my Daniel Smith here, and some of them are very new, like this one here. Okay? But the point is, I make it my practice without fail of spraying. I mean, dousing my palettes with water before I paint. Okay. These are my Holbeins. These have been used for years and years and years. They've been refilled and refilled and refilled. This is a vintage palette. I have not treated it with any special type of spray. I mix in here. I spray the entire palette literally before I paint. And as you can see, everything is still beautifully intact. Now, I realize that this palette may feel very messy for some of you because we all have different practices, different sensory kind of sensitivities when it comes to organizing our palettes. I know some of you might like your little half pans to have some separation in between, and you wonder, gosh, okay, fine. The metal doesn't rust. There's no problems there. I got you, Kristy. Don't your colors run together when you spray? Now, when a half pan is overfilled, it's got that hump. And a lot of half pans that you buy pre-made by handmade sellers do have that hump. Also, I made these myself from tubes, and I often get the hump. So yes, when you spray and you have a couple of pans next to each other that all have the hump, there is that chance that one color will start to run into another. But it never really bothers me, and I urge you to not let it bother you. Here's why. One of my favorite techniques for painting is every time I go back to the palette, if I'm painting a green leaf, let's say, I want to pick up a new green, a new version of that green. Now, that is very specific to my style, but it works really well in creating a very enlivened, energetic, kind of just fun painting where I'm not worrying about mixing and remixing the perfect color all the time. So if you have a little bit of your Naples flooded slightly into your cadmium yellow, it's not a big deal because they're both yellow, and it's just going to make your painting, that brush when it hits the paper, that much more interesting. So here is another example. These are my Rosa paints. Lovely, lovely brand, by the way. I think these are Rosa. Anywho, you notice these are factory filled pans and they don't have the hump. They are almost actually kind of indented. You can see that. So concave, right? This is even less of a worry when you spray everything down. It's soaking, dripping wet. You're not going to have as much kind of overflow, if any. So keep that in mind as well. But overall, just know that your paints aren't nearly as persnickety, precious as you think they are. What is most precious is for you to actually use them and use them with reckless abandon because they're meant for you to be used. And also, they're going to last a lot longer than you could ever imagine. I always say I have more paints in my collection than I'll ever use in a lifetime. And I realize that's not the case for everyone. Here's some Japanese style watercolors. These are perfect. They will not intermingle easily if you give them a good dousing of water. But I urge you, use what you have, use it like you mean it, and don't be afraid of that spray down. In the previous section, I got the most comments about that liner brush that I was using for the watercolor sketching. And while I didn't get a ton of questions about the liner brush, because I think folks were just so excited at the revelation of using one in the way that I showed them, I know that you have the questions because since that original video posted, I have been inundated with how in the world do I use this thing the way that you do? So I want to give you a deeper dive into using the liner brush in a way that won't leave you frustrated. The first thing to know is not all liner brushes are created equal. Mine is synthetic and it's only about 1.125 inches long. So it actually gives you a lot of control compared to, say, if you grabbed a longer rigger style brush and one that may also have been made with natural bristles. So just keep that in mind. Water control, here we go again, is really important when it comes to using a liner brush because you kind of have to get that perfect amount, that perfect ratio of water to paint. And you also really need to remember that with my specific liner brush, you're going to need to be reloading with paint and water pretty often. That is normal. Now, if you want to know more about my supplies that I've been using throughout this mastermind, all of them are listed below in the description. I'm going to mix up some paint here in my palette, and I'm doing it with a larger brush. And that is one recommendation I have, to not try to mix color too much with your liner. It's a more delicate brush, and honestly, it's just going to take you longer because it doesn't hold as much paint. You want to make yourself a nice puddle. And here's a great angle so you can see just how saturated with paint and how much water is in that mix. Now, when you're loading that liner brush, you don't want to load it so much that you're seeing a little bead form at the end of the bristles. But this is where it gets annoying and tricky. You almost want there to be a bead forming. So you want the end of the brush to kind of look thicker. And you can really see that here. Now there's a bead. You don't want the bead. And there it is. The bristles are a little bit thicker now because they've got just enough paint on there. Now, I promise you, the more you load this brush and the more times you get that bead and it makes a mess on your paper, you're going to understand how much is too much and how much is just right. Now, when you feel you have it just right, I want you to just make a wavy line across your paper. Make that line until the paint starts to run out. Here's a goal for you. Try to get a nice, smooth line that's about 5 inches long. So load your brush up enough so that you can do this nice continuous stroke for about 5 inches without the paint starting to run out. That's your goal. So yes, it is another exercise. And oh my gosh, look at that bead. That is definitely not what you want, but I'm going to show you what happens. You're going to have so much of a thicker line at the beginning where you first touch down to the paper. Now, if you've accomplished the 5-inch long, wavy, smooth line, I want you to go ahead and try some swirls. The thing about swirls is that you're working more from your elbow or even your shoulder. The movement isn't coming as much from your fingers. As a matter of fact, if you're trying to make that swirl happen by moving your fingers and moving your knuckles, you're going to get swirls that don't feel really organic. So you want to get that movement coming from the shoulder, ideally, or the elbow, not your knuckles. Now, you also want to play around with where you're holding the brush. I hold mine somewhere in that top first third of the brush's length coming from the tip. Try it out, see if that feels good for you. It may not, and you may want to try something else. Another thing that I do is I often will hold my brush almost perpendicular to the page. You can see that here. Not quite perfectly perpendicular. Try that hold also. See how it feels for you. It may not work for you. Not all brush holds are going to work for everyone holding the brush. All right, I want you to give it a go and just keep in mind that bead and making a lovely puddle in your palette, mixing well to work from.